Is the recent and ongoing assault in the media against the VA disability compensation program a coordinated narrative or psychological operation?
As a weapon of war, psychological warfare is no novelty. It is as old as war itself. But the use of this force as an integral part of combat has now taken on new forms. And it works in many different ways. The printed word and the spoken word both hammer away at a single objective: defeat the enemy.
I'm Dr. Sharma, physician, board-certified psychiatrist, and Air Force veteran. This is really a vital question, especially with the recent news articles in the media and other coverage. The first thing I want to mention is that I don't use the term psychological operation or PSYOP lightly. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot these days, and it even has a slang definition for when someone doesn't like a particular narrative. But in a military operation, a PSYOP is aimed at influencing an individual or group of people's state of mind through nonviolent means. It's basically coordinated information warfare to achieve a goal. It involves propaganda and strategic messaging to shape perceptions and the behavior of a target audience. This is often used to create fear, confusion, or influence people's decisions. I also want to talk about Chase Hughes, a retired U.S. Navy chief and behavioral science expert. He's known for training intelligence agencies in influence and behavioral profiling. He had a 20-year Navy career. He's an author, has an amazing YouTube channel, which I'll link below. He was also recently interviewed by Sean Ryan on his podcast. Chase developed the Narrative Control Index, or NCI, a scoring system to detect psychological manipulation in information campaigns. There are 20 factors going from timing, emotional tone, use of authority, and other factors that get scored for a total of up to 100 points. This indicates how engineered a narrative is. So what we're going to do is we're going to use this scoring system to determine if the current media and political narrative about fraud and abuse in the VA disability system is actually a coordinated narrative. Basically, if it ticks all the boxes, that this fraud crisis storyline is a deliberate influence operation. As most of you know, the Washington Post did a series of articles. These were really high profile and alleged widespread abuse of VA disability benefits. These had sensational titles like How Some Veterans Exploit the $193 billion VA Program Due to Lax Controls, as well as The VA's Disability Program is an honor system. These veterans are defrauding it. They often describe veterans as swamping the system with exaggerated claims. They talk about brazen fraud and anecdotal cases of veterans faking blindness or paralysis to collect large sums of money. It's very eye-catching, right? And they try to highlight other statistics, saying that veterans get paid for having eczema, hemorrhoids, or foot fungus, and that this costs billions of dollars. But this narrative didn't stop at the Washington Post, or else I wouldn't be doing this video on whether or not it's a controlled narrative. The Economist did something similar, which I did a video on in the past. They said that the American veterans now receive absurdly generous benefits, that the disability ratings are widely unreasonable, and that cutting benefits might be necessary because, quote, America's veteran obsession has gone too far. The National Law Review also weighed in with legal commentary on the disability system itself, pretty much reinforcing the notion that the system has serious integrity issues. Of course, there were voices in the political arena. I did a video on retired Lieutenant Colonel Gade who weighed in on this topic. He talked about how only in the VA system are flat feet and tinnitus a disability. He talked about how most claims are frivolous and 9 out of the top 10 disabilities are completely unverifiable or easily exaggerated. And of course, there were politicians who seized the moment to create a commission to overhaul the VA disability compensation system. There were also a lot of op-eds and think tank reports, political organizations supporting these tighter controls and wanting to crack down on fraud. So this barrage of stories and statements felt a bit unusually coordinated. This all happened within a short span of time with multiple prestigious outlets and officials all hammering the same talking points: fraud, abuse, exaggerated claims, overly generous system. The tone was emotional, it was alarmist, and it created a sense of urgency to get things changed. So let's walk through the NCI categories with this. First, it's timing. Does the narrative launch or spike at a strategically useful time? It does. The sudden surge in this coverage closely coincided with political moments like the VA's budget being reviewed, Congress debating spending in general, the recent government shutdown. The first post-exposés actually dropped as the fiscal year budgets were being finalized. After the articles, a Senate committee was immediately called to address the concerns that the Post raised. It was really convenient, and as if the narrative was kind of teed up to influence policy. In information warfare, you often see narratives deployed at the right moment to sway the decision makers. Second is emotional manipulation. Does it push those emotional buttons like outrage, fear, or betrayal? This one is absolutely. The media framing has a lot of emotional language and imagery that's designed to provoke people. For instance, the Post opened by saying that veterans are exploiting the country's sacred commitment to its wounded, a phrase that evokes this sense of betrayal of a holy trust, right? And the articles are filled with phrases like brazen fraud, dubious claims, con artists, malingerers. One of the pieces from the Post described how a hidden camera caught a veteran who claimed to be wheelchair-bound actually walking into a store. This is exactly the type of imagery that evokes outrage. This is especially significant in today's social media landscape, and it encourages the audience to feel that veterans are scamming the system and the taxpayer at large. And this is extremely easy since most people don't understand the VA disability benefits system and how difficult it is to get those benefits. Number 3, uniform messaging. Are the same keywords and themes repeated in different outlets, creating sort of a unified chorus? Yes. Across newspapers, magazines, and speeches, there were terms that were very commonly used, and they were repeated. Fraud, exaggeration, abuse, gaming the system, malingerers. Multiple articles used the term rampant to describe fraud and that benefits were generous. People talking about this discussed cracking down on abuse, almost like everyone received the same memo and everyone had already decided. Even the framing, basically talking about veterans with minor ailments like foot fungus or eczema versus the real wounded heroes, which is implying those are the folks who were in combat or were seriously injured in combat. This narrative was synced up and typically doesn't happen by accident. Number 4, missing information. Does the narrative omit critical context or facts that would paint a different picture? 100%. What's not being said is as telling as what is being said. Nowhere in the fraud narratives was there adequate mention of why disability claims have increased. This includes the 20 years of war in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places that people don't talk about. These conflicts created hundreds of thousands of legitimate injuries, both physical and psychological. But these media articles gave little to no weight to this context. These articles basically cherry-picked these trivial examples, right? Like the hemorrhoids or the anecdotes of the people committing fraud, and they made it seem like this was happening across the board. Leaving out this type of context is classic in psychological operations because it creates a one-sided story. The 5th factor is simplistic narrative. Does it get boiled down to a black and white or good versus evil type of story? Does it oversimplify reality? Yes, it does. It's framed as heroes versus villains, the media portraying dishonorable or cheating veterans versus a sacred system for true heroes. It's a bit cartoonish, right? Even this type of dichotomy, which absolutely is not reality. The nuance here is that two things can be true at the same time. The system can have fraud, but can also have many deserving cases. And of course, that nuance is lost. The Post even said that the exaggerations and fraud were making it harder for veterans with genuine needs. Again, it's black and white, it's the real veterans versus the fakers. Of course, this misses the systemic issues, the personal struggles, and everything else that goes along with trying to get benefits. Once again, in a PSYOP, this is an effective way to galvanize public sentiment, identifying a clear enemy. Number 6, tribal division. Same here. It creates an us versus them narrative and a wedge between groups. This puts a division between veterans, veteran service organizations, and these media outlets and government figures. Even within the group of veterans itself, you can have an us versus them mentality, where certain veterans think that their claims are actually legitimate versus others who aren't. The seventh factor is authority overload. Are experts or authorities heavily cited to add credibility to the narrative? Yes, indeed. The fraud narrative leans on multiple authorities. The Washington Post cited government watchdogs, inspectors general, prosecutors, and even a former VA inspector general to try to validate its claims, again, cherry-picking the information. The anecdotal cases of fraud are highlighted by a lot of authority figures, like in the Senate hearing with Dr. Cheryl Mason testifying about these known cases of fraud, adding even more weight. Basically, flooding the zone with expert quotes and statistics, it can actually overwhelm the audience into accepting the narrative. Number 8, call for urgent action. Does the narrative demand immediate action or drastic responses? Same here. Yes, there's a drumbeat for action. The narrative implies that something must be done, and it must be done fast. Within days of the media blitz, there were calls for concrete actions, proposing new commissions to overhaul the system, tightening eligibility, more investigations, even pausing claims or removing benefits for veterans receiving under a particular threshold or percentage, depending on who's talking about the topic. There was basically a sense of alarm to try to steer public opinion. The ninth factor is overuse of novelty. Does it rely on shocking, novel facts or figures without context to grab attention? Absolutely. The $190 billion price tag of VA disability was talked about repeatedly as this kind of jaw-dropping number. The Washington Post led with it, and it instantly framed the issue as a huge money drain. But the number itself is meaningless because there's no context. What portion of that money might be fraud? None of that information was given, especially considering that the 20-year war on terror cost $8 trillion from the taxpayer. And you best believe there was fraud, waste, and abuse in that $8 trillion, which means the veterans benefit system is just 0.02% of what was spent on the war on terror. Of course, that context was not given. These anecdotes have a lot of novelty, right? Outrageous stories of fraud, like the veteran faking paralysis for $1 million, another veteran faking his death in a canoe to avoid fraud charges. These stories are extreme and they fascinate the public. They get a lot of clicks. It's shock 101 and a classic manipulation strategy. Number 10, financial and political gain. Is there an apparent money or power motive behind pushing this narrative? This one is likely. When you peel back the layers, this supposed fraud epidemic narrative stands to benefit certain agendas, especially those looking to cut federal spending on veterans. Policymakers aiming to trim the budget or divert their funds elsewhere would definitely be interested in this. Always think about who would benefit from these types of changes. You have to think about the Heritage Foundation, Project 2025, and other political agendas and initiatives. If the public can be convinced that many claims or most claims are illegitimate, it greases the wheels for these cost-cutting reforms that might have been unpopular without the psyop. Like I always say, follow the money. The 11th factor is suppression of dissent. Are opposing views or contrary evidence ignored or silenced in the narrative? Yes, the initial narrative largely sidelined dissenting voices, like the Washington Post articles not including perspectives from major veterans organizations or any experts who might challenge their fraud claims. Paralyzed Veterans of America asked why none of the big veteran service officers were interviewed, despite them representing millions of veterans. Other organizations pushed back as well. The DAV, VFW, American Legion, they pointed out flaws or the fact that fraud is a tiny fraction of claims. Their responses got relatively little coverage compared to the screaming fraud headlines that we talked about. To be clear, the Post eventually published a defensive response because they noted all the backlash, but this was only after the narrative had already been set and the damage was done. As a result, you won't hear the real numbers, like the VA's own estimate that veteran-perpetuated fraud is only 3.7% of cases investigated. Things like that were buried and not headlined. 12. False dilemmas. Does it present a black and white choice and ignore nuanced solutions? Yes, for this as well. What the public will hear from these headlines is either you crack down hard on fraud and support integrity, or you're letting lazy veterans game the system. It implies that if you question this crusade, you're somehow soft on fraud, or you're disrespecting real injured veterans. It's a false dilemma. Again, like I said before, two things can be true at the same time. We can acknowledge the need to catch fraud and at the same time see that the system overall works for veterans at large. Tammy Duckworth, the senator, who also spoke at the hearing, highlighted this. She tried to speak against these talking points. She said how we can't allow a minority of criminals to dictate a redesign of the entire system that would hurt everyone. She was rejecting the false binary. Number 13, the bandwagon effect. Do multiple sources and influencers pile on, creating the impression that everyone believes it? Yes, especially early on. There was a bandwagon. Within days of the Washington Post series, there were multiple outlets and figures who echoed the same storyline. This goes with The Economist, National Review, legal blogs, Capitol Hill, all talking about veterans gaming the system. And even some politicians taking these statistics as facts without any questioning. And you might be saying, well, that was just early on and then it evolved. Think about the attention span of people these days. Once they see these articles or hear the information from these articles, they're going to move on. They're going to have it settled in their mind. Even though it might backtrack later in the future, the narrative has been set. Number 14, emotional repetition. Are certain emotionally charged words, images, or stories repeated over and over again to reinforce the message? Absolutely, and it's a clear pattern. The narrative architects hit on a few emotional concepts and they just kept hammering them home. The idea that dishonorable veterans are betraying the system, this was a common theme in story after story, again highlighting these outrageous anecdotes of people faking illnesses or injuries to get benefits, the story of the veteran who faked being blind, that got a lot of attention and coverage. The repetition of these stories drives home the feeling that the fraud is happening everywhere. The 15th factor is cherry-picked data. We've gone over this before, but yes, it is highly cherry-picked, like the numbers on veterans receiving disability for eczema or hemorrhoids or foot fungus, but leaving out information about why those things occurred, like toxic environments, and they judged this against the people who lost limbs in Iraq or Afghanistan. Again, implying that the money is going to rashes instead of amputations. Again, cherry-picked data that highlights black and white comparisons. The data about how many veterans who have PTSD, hearing loss, orthopedic injuries, and much more were downplayed because obviously that type of data would evoke sympathy rather than outrage. The fraud narrative also cited dozens of prosecutions for fraud as if that's a lot. But in the context of 7 million receiving benefits, that makes it less than 0.01%. By the way, just to clarify, eczema, hemorrhoids, those things are real. Those things have real impacts. I've seen veterans with eczema covering large portions of their body and even their face. I've seen where veterans can have extreme difficulties due to bleeding from hemorrhoids, so they are not a joke, but that's how the narrative paints it as. Number 16, logical fallacies. Does the argument rely on flawed logic or leaps in reasoning? Yep, the narrative relied on generalizations of the facts. It takes a small number of fraud cases and then leaps to portray the entire system as broken. It's the equivalent of saying as a teacher, hey, I caught a few people cheating, which means most people must be cheating, so I'm going to fail the entire class. It just doesn't make sense from an evidence-based point of view. The Washington Post series used phrasing like millions of claims from minor afflictions in contrast to fewer combat injuries. Again, it suggests this widespread fakery. The narrative also employs false equivalence, implying that because eczema is common, it must be illegitimate to claim, which doesn't follow logically. The Guardian actually noted this in their analysis, that the Washington Post articles were flawed as it conflated several dozen convicted fraudsters with a notion of widespread fraud. At 17, we have manufactured outrage. Does it seem like the outrage or crisis is being artificially stoked for effect. I think we hammered this home already. Yes, the outrage feels orchestrated. The speed, intensity, the firestorm of articles in the media and discussions in politics appear to be stoked. The news outlets also tried to amplify the shock using emotional cues like flag imagery, references to dishonor, basically things to try to get the public angry. This is easy to do with the VA disability benefit system, since most people don't know much about it unless they're veterans. Number 18, is the story framed in a way to prime certain interpretations? So this includes like moral framing, loaded metaphors, and as you might guess, the answer is yes. The narrative is actually framed as a moral crisis, almost like a moral decay among veterans. That moral term is used a lot in articles and also in the Senate testimony. It makes it seem like it's a betrayal of honor, when veterans should be honorable, but they're abusing the system. Thus, they're tarnishing their honor. At 19, we have rapid behavior shifts. Has the narrative caused quick changes in either behavior or policy that seem unnatural? This one is actually less evident in this case because we don't have enough data yet on whether or not ordinary people are suddenly changing their behavior, at least on a massive scale due to the narrative. We'll have to wait to evaluate this one further when it comes to the behavior change. But on the policy front, we do see attempts at rapid policy moves. The Senate hearing, proposals for commissions and tighter rules. So this does indicate there are things moving with the power brokers. Last but not least is the 20th factor, historical parallels. Does the narrative resemble past propaganda or psychological operation campaigns? Yes, we've seen this before in American history. The way the narrative portrays disabled veterans actually goes back to past instances when benefits recipients were demonized to sway public opinion. For instance, after the Civil War, there were waves of rhetoric about veterans as loafers or greedy pension grabbers. By the 1890s, publications were calling veterans helpless and greedy and that they were whining for support. That narrative actually paved the way for pension reforms back then. There were similar media outcries after the Vietnam War. Fast forward to the 20th century, we had the welfare queen trope to spark public outrage against the welfare system. The current narrative tries to frame the disabled veterans as the new welfare cheats to justify cutting back entitlements. Once we tally all these factors, and I know that was a lot, meaning all the 20 categories and individual scores, the VA fraud narrative racks up an NCI score of 64 out of 100. This indicates a strong likelihood that we're dealing with a coordinated psychological operation, or at least a concerted narrative shaping campaign. By the way, I scored this independently first, and then I had ChatGPT do a deep research score after I fed the NCI criteria, as well as the articles, and asked it to look across the web. The ChatGPT score was actually slightly higher by 2 points, so it looks like I was even giving the benefit of the doubt to the narrative a little bit. Regardless, both scores were quite high. So what this means is that the narrative is not just organic, right? It's not a type of journalism that just cropped up and these media articles just spread. It shows signs of strategic messaging, the type of messaging that is meant to manipulate public opinion. It suggests that the VA disability fraud crisis has been manufactured and magnified far beyond the underlying reality, likely to advance certain agendas. At the same time, I'm not saying that this is a grand conspiracy. What I mean is not every reporter or senator or whoever talking about this sat down in a smoke-filled room and they sat down together and they were plotting this. No. Realistically, some of the people participating may actually really believe their narrative due to their own biases or limited information, and others might be politically motivated. There might be behind-the-scenes coordination by think tanks, political organizations, or officials. These are the folks who tend to recognize a useful narrative when they see one. But obviously, this narrative is dangerous. If it's unchallenged, it tarnishes the dignity of all veterans. Yes, there is fraud, no doubt about it, like in most government programs. But we need to remember that the vast majority of disabled veterans earn their benefits through real sacrifice. They have real physical and mental injuries, and we have to recognize them. Targeting things like PTSD or hearing loss as fake conditions is ignorant and cruel. Remember, Whenever you hear an emotionally charged or one-sided narrative in the media, always question it. This is not only with veterans topics, but pretty much anything. Big events in the media, politics, right versus left rhetoric, everything. You always have to take a step back and ask, who benefits from me believing this? What facts are missing? You have to look for these red flags, and you can use this NCI criteria to help you. Let me know your thoughts on this topic in the comments. As always, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think about this? Do you think that this looks like a coordinated narrative or psyop? Or do you think it's actually organic journalism based on real facts and it's not coordinated at all? Are you worried about this? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, you might like the episode I did on the truth about VA disability compensation and whether veterans are getting too much. Click over here to check it out. Also, click over here to subscribe if you haven't already done so. I want to thank you for joining me for this episode, and please like and comment. That stuff really helps the channel. As always, thanks for watching. Dr. Sharma signing off. See you next time.